Today's topic was a loud story in Spain. I'll remind you if you missed it. The unknown people sent letters with explosives. They terrorized the authorities of the country and even got the prime minister. And the same packages were sent to Ukrainian embassies in different European countries. It turned out that the militants of the Russian Imperial Movement, or RIM, were behind this, supported by Russian intelligence. And here it's important to understand who are these Imperials, how did they turn from a bunch of marginals into an organization capable of terrorist attacks in Europe, what is their role in the war against Ukraine, and how influential in this force in Russia itself, what else are they capable of? I'm Oleksii Matsuka, and in this video we will find answers to all these questions. So, about Spain, their parcels with explosive devices were sent to various addresses in Madrid. They were delivered to the Minister of Defense, the Office of the Prime Minister, and to the Ukrainian and American embassies. The mine package was also sent to the manufacturer of the C-90 rocket launchers, the weapons company Instalaza, which are supplied to Ukraine. Only one package exploded in the Ukrainian diplomatic mission. The commandant opened it but managed to throw it aside before the device worked. An embassy employee was injured. The rest of the explosives were defused. Together with the investigators of the Spanish National Police, American and British intelligence worked on a high-profile investigation. And now the New York Times, citing officials in the United States, published Insider. The Russian Imperial Movement, which acted on a tip from the Russian GRU, is probably behind the bombs. The scandal has once again shown that acting unprofessionally and often by proxy is the typical method of the Russian special services. Just remember the story of the poisoning of the Skripal family and Petrov and Bashirov Russian agents with their excuses. They say they came to see the Salisbury Cathedral. This is also confirmed by another, more dangerous trend. Now, Russian state structures cover neo-Nazi ultra-right movements and direct their activists far outside the country. The New York Times believes that this is an attempt by the Kremlin to intimidate Western countries and to warn partners of Ukraine. Russia will not stop even at the most radical steps.
The apparent aim of the action was to signal that Russia and its proxies could carry out terrorist strikes across Europe, including in the capitals of member states of NATO, which is helping defend Ukraine against Russia's invasion. From the New York Times publication.
It's time to find out who are the Russian Imperials which were involved in this scheme. They started in 2002 as an opposition to the current Russian government. They criticized domestic politics and even ended up on the list of potentially dangerous organizations compiled by the Russian special services. Their websites and social networks were banned, their leaders were followed, but everything changed instantly in 2014.
The year 2014 served as a turning point for Russian Imperial Movement. These developments jolted intergroup relations in the Russian far right and led the Russian Imperial Movement to turn its focus beyond Russian domestic politics. Analysis of the Center for International Security and Cooperation, Stanford University.
You may have heard about the military units in the east of Ukraine, which since 2014 have been acting on their own without obeying anyone. So they were trained by the paramilitary unit of this very RIM, the Imperial Legion, which was headed by a certain Denis Gariev. He actively recruited militants for the war against Ukraine in the Donbass, personally participated in the hostilities and was wounded. Specially for this purpose, the partisan program has been created. militants are intensively trained, these guys, to help the pro-Russian forces fighting in the east of Ukraine. Formally, it operates with the framework of a structure left over from Soviet times, DASAV, the Volunteer Society for Assistance to the Army, Aviation and Navy. In fact, it turns into a conveyor line for the training of militants known for their particular cruelty. Partizan created a closed course which was not written about in social networks or on websites, but where not only Russians aspired to get. It began to attract extremists from other countries because the accurate skills were given to try out in real combat. So the Russian Imperial Movement became one of the authorities among the most diverse organizations around the world, pitching the priority of the white race. What did it result in by 2023? Several Western journalist colleagues who studied this topic in depth confirmed to me at once, yes, the Russian Imperials are trying to create a network around the world and continue to train militants for terrorist activities in other regions. The expert of our today's program agrees with this. Jason Blazakis, one of the best American specialists who has been studying such organizations for many years.
The Kremlin, there are multiple camps that the Russian Imperial Movement has within St. Petersburg, in that general area, where they train a broad range of extremists to carry out terrorist activities worldwide. So one of the very first points I would like to make is the fact that while the group is primarily based in Russia, it has trained individuals to carry out attacks overseas. And most poignantly on that, the organization trained an individual in 2017 that carried out the very well-known attacks in Gothenburg, Sweden. So that's an example of the organization training a foreign-based person who carried out an attack overseas. More recently,
what happened in Sweden? They planted bombs in refugee centers. This was done by the neo-Nazi organization Northern Resistance Movement, which also operates in Finland, Denmark, Norway and Ireland. And they all studied military affairs. Yes, you guessed it, at the same Russian Imperial Movement. The regime added a headache to the German Internal Security Service when it became known that the two most radical forces in Germany, the Young Nationalists and the Third Way, are sending their activities there for training to Russian Imperials. By the way, the nephew of the famous propagandist Dmitry Kiselyov, Sergei Kiselyov, a German citizen by the way, according to the German investigation, studied in the military camps of the RIT. For participation in hostilities in the Donbass in Germany, he was sentenced to more than 2 years in prison. As a result, a small Russian group becomes a challenge for the whole of Europe.
I would say that since 2015 this Russian Imperial Movement has posed an increasing threat to European societies. Many things can be dangerous for Western societies, but at the same time they can be useful for the Kremlin. Anton Shekhovtsov, director of the Vienna Center for Democratic Principles.
In search of allies who share their ideology, the regime did not limit themselves to Europe, but even built bridges across the ocean, for which the United States and Canada have included them in the list of terrorist organizations. Imagine, even the Wagnerites were recently included not in the terrorist list, but in the list of international criminal organizations. And then the Russian Imperials, which many in Ukraine may not have heard of, were officially called terrorists by the State Department for the first time in history. And as our expert Jason Blazakis confirms, there are plenty of reasons for this.
The organization has had links, of course, to American extremists. It's important for us to understand that the Russian Imperial Movement is an organization that has also white supremacist and neo-Nazi tendencies within it and within its membership. And that's very appealing, unfortunately, to many Americans. And there was one American specifically who worked very closely with the Russian Imperial Movement, an individual by the name of Matthew Heimbach, who was an individual convicted for carrying out violent activities in Charlottesville, Virginia.
Here, let me remind you, in August 2017, the Unite of Right rally was held in Virginia. The event turned out to be large-scale, gathered thousands of people, but ended in clashes with law enforcement officers, and a car ran over a crowd of anti-fascists. During the riots, one person was killed and about 40 were injured. In addition, as a result of the crash of a police helicopter, 2 law enforcement officers were killed. Among those who were trained by the Russian Imperials is the American Rinaldo Nazzaro, who led the neo-Nazi movement The Base, the one that the FBI accused of preparing a race war in the United States. Its members planned to start by destroying the railroad tracks, poisoning the water supply. Nazzaro himself now lives in St. Petersburg, and the Russian authorities do not even mind at all, as it seems they are not against the existence on their territory of a structure that trains militants and extremists from all over the world, as long as they all act in the interest of Moscow. You will be surprised, but Rym still criticizes Putin for the war on the Ukrainian front. The truth is not for the fact that he untied it, but for the fact that they say he is too soft with Ukraine. But they, unlike the real opposition, are forgiven. Indeed, in the current situation, the Kremlin needs any allies as long as they are on the same side.
So to me, this is a great concern. Regarding the organization's links beyond the oligarchs, there are obviously a relationship that the Russian Imperial Movement has with the Kremlin in a more formal manner. And again, that played out very obviously recently with the letter bomb campaign, in which the Russian Imperial Movement may have been an important player in. The fact that it may be connected to Russian intelligence services and acting at the behest of the Russian government, this is illustrative of the fact that the group does have connections at very high levels.
The connections of the Imperials are also known. The Kremlin oversees the Rym, acting through intermediaries.
In Russia itself, the organization is not banned. It is obvious that, roughly speaking, the organization is protected by people who are close to power. I would not say that these people created it, but they are a kind of useful fascists who are not touched. Anton Chekhovtsov, director of the Vienna Center for Democratic Principles.
Among these intermediaries, the most famous is the Orthodox oligarch Konstantin Malafeyev. But with all the formal detachment, their actions are directly connected with the Kremlin. The dossier, the Center of Investigations of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, found out.
They arrange meetings for the Western far right with Russian officials and are able to influence even Vladimir Putin's busy schedule. From the investigation of the Dossier Center.
Why does the Kremlin need them, and what is the connection with Ukraine? With regard to the terrorist attacks in Spain, Moscow's logic is clear. Any destabilization of the situation in the capitals of Western countries, in their opinion, is capable of switching the attention of Europeans to internal problems, distracting them from the war in Ukraine. And this is a dangerous game, say the experts with whom I spoke while preparing this video. After all, the Kremlin deliberately supports radical fanatics whose appetites only continue to grow. Can they become the force that, if the change of power in Russia will begin to interrupt peace negotiation, the return of Ukrainian occupied territories? Yes, they will obviously be against it. But as my colleagues said off the record, the regime will not start a revolution in Russia. The forces are not the same. But to join the players more seriously, start riots in the country, they can do it. Can the regime influence the situation on the Ukrainian front line also? No. If the Wagner riots, according to the US Security Council, number a force over 50,000 people in Ukraine now, then the Russian Imperials are a few hundred at most. What then is the danger? Why do they get so much attention? The fact is that the same Wagner has up to 80% of the mercenaries in the Donbass, former prisoners who are not really trained in anything. And they have one motivation: to go free even at the cost of going to war. Regime, unlike them, are super motivated and often with serious combat experience. They are driven not by money, by ideology. With the start of a full-scale invasion, the detachments in the Donbass, which all this time did not really obey anyone, were deprived of autonomy. The Kremlin doesn't really need them there. It's more useful in Europe, where over the years of training radicals from all over the world, the Imperials have acquired connections, where they are not afraid to act tough. And where, as many who have dealt with this topic suspect, Moscow would like to create another threat, trying to force the West to reckon with it, or at least don't get in touch and deal with it. And Spain, with the events in which we started this issue, is a very significant example of this. After all, letters with explosives could not really affect anything, but to declare a threat, an invisible presence, is easy. Will all this information affect Washington's willingness to recognize Russia itself as a state sponsor of terrorism, and how is the US prepared to respond to this threat from the Kremlin? We will definitely talk about this in the next videos. I'm Oleksii Matsuka, thanks for watching and see you soon.